Here to give an update on the current events taking place around the use of the fill pile and what's happening with our parks and ball fields. Just to be clear, I'm very concerned, very upset by these events. This has been a violation of public trust. We've been let down. No one is allowed to contaminate our town. This material should never have been used on our parks and ball fields. We're moving as quickly as possible to test and remediate our fields where needed. We're committed to making our fields and our parks safe for everyone. We're working with the Department of Health, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, known as DEEP, as well as Ty and Bond, our licensed environmental professional. As a bit of an intro, I'm here with Sans Cleary, our Director of Health, and Jim Olsen from Ty and Bond. We want to give you an update as to where we are and a bit of a background in terms of how we got here. Going forward, we're going to have public meetings on Wednesday and Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. That's August 21st and 22nd. That will be publicized on the news media, so please stay tuned for that. We'll have 2 additional meetings the following week. The goal of these is to keep everybody updated and give everybody a chance to ask questions and get some answers. And we'll have more of these if needed. Our goal is full transparency. We're going to have press releases going out to inform the public at each step of the way. And the test results, as we get them back, will be posted on our webpage, www.fairfieldct.org/fill-use-issues. With that, I've got Sans Cleary on my left, our Director of our Health Department, and Jim Olsen on my right from Ty and Bond. I'm going to ask Sans to give us an update as to where we are.
Sure, thanks, Mike. So in regards to Gould Manor Park, so the DEP did some testing there, and I'm going to give you an update about, as concisely as I can, about the results of those tests. So they collected 10 soil samples, 10 samples altogether. 9 of those are soil samples, where 8 of those are composite samples with multiple samples gathered and put together, and then 1 single grab sample for comparison. And then they did collect 1 sample of pieces of shingles found on the surface and tested that for asbestos. Those 9 soil samples were analyzed for over 71 different parameters. And so we also had those results analyzed 2 different times. So initially, just to characterize if that waste was hazardous waste, there was an initial toxicity characteristic leaching procedure test done, a T-clip test. And that determined that the materials used did not meet the standards for hazardous waste, and that information has already been previously reported. These same samples then were tested again for what's called a mass analysis for metals, which gives us some different information regarding the materials there. As previously announced, all the soil samples collected contain no PCBs, no herbicides, no pesticides, no volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds, and no asbestos fibers in the soils themselves. The shingle pieces collected from this surface did come back as positive for non-friable asbestos. And then the new results that we have today, yesterday we received them late, and is that the 4 samples from that mass analysis had exceedances for arsenic, and 1 of those samples had an exceedance for lead. Now, these are slightly above the standards that initiate some type of action. And so just to talk about those a bit, the residential standard for arsenic is, we'll call it a level of 10. These came back at, anything from 10.8 to 15.2 in that range. Arsenic can be a naturally occurring element found in the soils, and Connecticut ranges anywhere from 0 to 40 found in the soils. This is above the standard. We are putting together a plan to address that. In addition, 1 of those same samples came back positive with a level of 506, which is slightly above the 400 level where you have to take some type of action. Okay. In the previous update, we indicated that there was some barium found with the T-clip test. When we did the mass analysis, the barium found was well below the levels that require any action. So the results are posted on the website. We have, later today, we'll be posting some sort of a guide of this information, as well as how to read those samples a little bit better. We're trying to give that to you. And then that's the update for Gould Manor Park. When we talk about the schools now, we're moving forward with a list of, we've brought a list of 20 other sites, 9 of which are school sites that we are working towards this week to do all the testing there. Those sites were selected because we had information that some of the potentially contaminated fill may have been used during the regular maintenance of the soccer fields. So each year they maintain the soccer fields in such a way to keep them level and safe for the players, but the goalie boxes and certain areas tend to wear more, so they come in and they level those out and put sod or grass seed if it's off season to restore those areas. That's the type of activity that we're talking about. The amount of fill used and topsoil used varies from site to site, but all those sites will be assessed. Then we're looking at any other sports field in town where any of that fill or topsoil was used, any other town recreation area where that fill or topsoil was used, and then any other site in the town where that fill or topsoil was used as well. That'll all be looked at, and so that's how we're looking at the other sites. Mr. Olsen's going to give us a little bit more information about where they're going with their sites. And then I just wanted to make sure we say that, all of this, we had conversations. As soon as we got the results, we were on the phone with representatives from the Department of Public Health, conferring with them and Mr. Olsen from Ty and Bond about what approaches we take, and in addition, we've had conversations with the Connecticut Deep to review what we're planning to do and getting their input and their guidance in terms of what steps we should take next. And so I guess I'll turn it over to Mr. Olsen now.
Thanks, Sans. Hello, I'm Jim Olsen from Ty and Bond. I'm a licensed environmental professional. The town hired Ty and Bond to provide environmental consulting services for this project. We initially provided a supplemental investigation on Gould Manor Park. We're getting the results in on sampling that we conducted, and so far the sampling is consistent with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection findings. We also were provided with a list of 20 priority sites in town where fill potentially could have been used. We developed a program to expedite the evaluation of those properties. We're currently doing that right now as we speak. We're prioritizing the 8 to 9 school sites on the list of 20. We plan on getting those school sites visually inspected and sampled today and tomorrow. We are submitting samples to the laboratory for analysis and plan to get those results by the end of the week. We also plan on completing the remaining 20 sites by the end of the week for visual evaluation and sampling. So we have a 3-part process where, one, we call an expedited environmental screening, where we visually observe the site for fill, working with Public Works on where fill potentially was used on these sites. And then we collect samples for laboratory analysis, for expedited analysis. Once we get those results back, we compare them to cleanup levels in the Connecticut remediation standard regulations, and then there's a decision to be made there. If the results are above those cleanup standards, there'll be further actions conducted on those properties. That will move into the next phase, which would be managing those impacts and risks. And we've worked with the town at developing several different temporary measures that can control access to these impacted soils. Then the third step would be remedial planning to close these sites out.
Oh, all right, thank you. Let me take a moment here in a few minutes to go through some highlights of what's happened since 2013. What I will be doing, this will be written up in more detail and posted on the web, but let me at least get some highlights to put what's happened in from a timeline perspective here. One, starting in 2013, Public Works decided to take a look at managing this Public Works yard differently, with the intent of getting the 40,000 cubic yards that were in place down and to lower that pile. So they went out with an RFP. Julian won that RFP and started operating the pile shortly thereafter. That went along pretty quietly, at least from my perspective. But in 2016, starting in January, February, I started hearing complaints from the neighbors that the pile wasn't going down. In fact, it was going up. We got an explanation starting in March from our Public Works, and I basically requested that I start getting weekly updates on how the pile is progressing and to make sure that, in fact, it is going down. So from March through the end of the Julian's contract in December, I was getting weekly updates showing that the amount of material moving off-site was less than the amount of material coming in. This proved out when Julian finally left the site and we did final measures. That proved out not to be accurate information. We also set up regular meetings with the neighborhood to discuss with them what's taking place and what actions we are taking to get the pile down. We also set up bi-weekly emails going out to the neighborhood so that they were fully involved in what was taking place. In addition, we set up a web page that is still up for anybody who wants to look at all the data that we collected over that time and made available. That's www.fairfieldct.org/pwyard. In July, August, we had continuing issues with Julian around truck noise, also the amount of noise coming from the construction yard. In September, I sent a letter to Julian saying that we were ending the contract in December and we would not be renewing it, that we needed to reassess how we're going to manage this going forward. Also, in conjunction with the neighbors, I instructed Public Works to have a licensed environmental professional firm on site starting in September to test the pile to make sure that it was as clean as we expected going forward, and nothing was left there after Julian left the site. In October, we heard about bond issues and went through and I instructed our purchasing department to evaluate the bond Julian had with us. It turned out it was not valid. I then instructed purchasing to check all of our bonds to make sure they were all valid, to update our bid process and purchasing procedures, to make sure that we verified all the data and didn't let some of the issues we were having with Julian or a company like this come again and work for the town in this regard. We immediately updated our bid process, upgraded our verification and validation procedures to make sure that the questions coming back on the RFPs were verified, so somebody couldn't just misstate or fill in the blank without us checking out what took place. As part of our LEP testing on November 29th, our LEP observed a Julian truck coming into the yard, driving around to a far portion of the yard, and dumping their fill. She proceeded to go over and take a sample of that fill because she thought that was a strange occurrence, certainly not normal. 2 weeks later, on December 13th, that sample came back as positive for PCBs and high lead content. We immediately shut the yard down and kicked Julian and their employees off-site. We also called Deep, and they came down the same day. We basically filled them in on everything we knew, including the test results, and looked for their guidance as to what takes place from then. From that point on, Deep told us to work with our LEP to come up with a remediation program. We tested for scope. We removed all the contaminants that contained PCBs and the high levels of lead. So those were no longer in the pile. Julian is required by the contract not to bring any contamination on site. They refused to pay for that remediation, so we proceeded to sue them to cover the cost of the $300,000 it cost us to remove the contamination. Shortly thereafter, in meeting with our conservation director, Brian Cleary, he made it clear that transporting and dumping that level of material could be a violation of federal or state laws. I asked our police to investigate to see if there were any legal violations and any need for criminal prosecution. In 2017, we continued to meet with the neighbors. We brought in a landscape architect to design a berm. We got approvals from Conservation, Town Planning and Zoning, and Connecticut Deep to approve that design and the implementation of that berm. In 2018, specifically in the spring, between roughly March and June, we built the berm, and importantly, all soil used in that berm was tested prior to use. We did that both to make sure the berm was safe overall, but also to make sure our employees working on it were safe. All the tests came back below the commercial industrial standard, which is typical for that type of construction project. In 2019, we got our first update on the criminal investigation when the search and seizure warrant background was released. And immediately thereafter, I placed Scott Bartlett on administrative leave. A couple weeks after that, there were actually arrest warrants issued with extensive affidavits. And at that point, I placed Joe Michelangelo on leave. In addition, there was a complaint to the police about Gould Manor, and that the police took that directly to Deep. Deep came down to do that test and did it in conjunction with our Department of Health representatives on site. We brought in Ty and Bond right away to make sure we were there to evaluate any of the test results that came back and identify any remediation that's needed. The test came back with some contaminants and some shingles. And the shingles tested positive for asbestos, which is obviously a concern. The next step is to refine this testing, which we've done, plus protect the site for any possible remediation. A number of steps from here. One, I do need to let everybody know that Scott Bartlett has been terminated. Last Friday, we also identified 20 sites that will proceed to test as quickly as possible. That's going to be done by the end of this week. The results will be available shortly thereafter. As each batch goes in, today's testing will be available in 48 hours, tomorrow's testing 48 hours after that. We will make sure that we identify what remediation is needed, if any, and communicate that out to everybody. As an interim measure on the, let me step first here. Yesterday, the test came back on the Gould Manor. Ty and Bond is reviewing and doing some additional sampling on that, but we will need to do some remediation, and as an interim measure, we're going to be covering the areas along the sidewalk. The sidewalk itself will still be open. However, we are going to protect the areas on each side and make sure those are covered where we will be doing remediation in the future. We will be holding, as I mentioned, public hearings on Wednesday and Thursday, and then again next week. And if we need to do public hearings after that as things go on, we will do that. We want to make sure that our ball fields and parks are safe for everybody as soon as possible. Right now, we have an unknown. We want to quickly test and quantify that unknown into a known so we can take appropriate action. They're either appropriately safe or not. We're working with Department of Health, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Ty and Bond, and our own health department to make sure that we're taking every step necessary to keep our residents safe. We're using Fair TV today to get the facts out to our residents as quickly as possible. We'll have further updates and time for Q&A, questions and answers, to make sure everybody gets their chance to ask a question on Wednesday, Thursday, as well as the public meetings the following week. I want to thank you for taking time to listen to this today, and we're working very hard to make sure Fairfield's safe as we can for every resident in our town. Thank you.